The morning I signed the papers, it was raining so hard the notary's parking lot had turned into a shallow lake. I sat in my truck, a 1998 Ford Ranger, with 213,000 miles and a passenger door that only opened from the outside, and held the deed against the steering wheel with both hands, the way you hold something you're afraid will blow away if you let go. 12 acres in Harlan County, Kentucky. 11 of them steep limestone hillside, rocky and brushy, covered in scrub cedar and tangled blackberry cane. One flat strip along a creek that flooded every March without apology. I had paid $15 for it. That isn't a figure of speech. The county tax auction had put the parcel on the block after 9 years of back taxes nobody wanted to absorb. Nobody bid against me. The woman at the registration table looked at my face, then at my age on my driver's license 19, and then back at my face the way people do when they're too polite to say what they're thinking out loud. She said, "Honey, you sure about this? There's nothing on that land. No well, no road, no reason anybody's touched it in 30 years. I told her I was sure. What none of us knew, not her, not the auctioneer, not me sitting in that flooded parking lot with the deed shaking in my hands, was that there was a reason nobody had touched it. And somebody had been waiting 80 years for me to find out why." The morning I signed the papers, it was raining so hard, the notary's parking lot had turned into a shallow lake. I sat in my truck, a 1998 Ford Ranger, with 213,000 miles and a passenger door that only opened from the outside, and held the deed against the steering wheel with both hands. The way you hold something you're afraid will blow away if you let go. 12 acres in Harlan County, Kentucky. 11 of them steep limestone hillside, rocky and brushy, covered in scrub cedar and tangled blackberry cane. One flat strip along a creek that flooded every March without apology. I had paid $15 for it. That isn't a figure of speech. The county tax auction had put the parcel on the block after 9 years of back taxes nobody wanted to absorb. Nobody bid against me. The woman at the registration table looked at my face, then at my age on my driver's license 19, and then back at my face the way people do when they're too polite to say what they're thinking out loud. She said, "Honey, you sure about this? There's nothing on that land. No well, no road, no reason anybody's touched it in 30 years. I told her I was sure. What none of us knew, not her, not the auctioneer, not me sitting in that flooded parking lot with the deed shaking in my hands, was that there was a reason nobody had touched it. And somebody had been waiting 80 years for me to find out why." My name is Tamsin Beauchamp. I was 19 years old that October, and I had $47 in my checking account. 6 goats, a dead mother, and a father who had walked out the door when I was 7 and never sent so much as a Christmas card. I had been raised mostly by my mother and partly by my great-aunt Lurleen, who had taken us in when the rent on our trailer in Pineville got more than my mother could carry. Aunt Lurleen had a small farm on Route 421, 4 miles east of the auction house. She had let us keep the goats on her back pasture, no charge, no questions. She believed in family the way some people believe in the church, quietly and without much ceremony, but with a faith so steady you could lean against it in the dark. Aunt Lurleen had died of pneumonia in August of that year. She was 73 years old, and she went peacefully in her own bed, with the morning sun coming through the curtains my mother had sewn for her in 2019. Her stepson, a man named Dell, who lived in Lexington and worked at a tire warehouse, inherited the farm. Dell didn't believe in family the way Aunt Lurleen had. Dell believed in equity. He told me politely the first time, and less politely the second, that he intended to put up a hay shed on the pasture I'd been using, and that I needed to have my goats off the property by December 1st. That was how I found myself at the county tax auction on a Thursday in October, with the last money I had in the world rolled up in the pocket of my jeans, looking for somewhere, anywhere, to move 6 animals I loved more than anything left to me in this world. The first parcel went for $9,000. The second for $14,000. The third for $3,200. I watched them go to men in clean boots and pressed shirts, men with checkbooks and trucks newer than mine. Then the auctioneer read out lot number 41, 12 acres in the northern hollow off Cawood Road. Steep terrain, no improvements, no road access of record. Minimum bid $15 plus accumulated tax debt of $2,340. The room went quiet, the way rooms do when something embarrassing happens. A man near the back laughed just once, the dry kind of laugh that isn't really a laugh. I raised my paddle. The auctioneer looked at me. He looked at the paddle. He looked at the empty room behind me, waiting for someone to bid against the teenage girl who had just offered $15 for a hillside nobody else wanted. No one did. Sold, he said, and he said it gently, the way a man says a thing he isn't sure should have happened. I drove out to the parcel that same afternoon just to look at it before the rain got worse. The gravel road past Cawood ran 3/4 of a mile up the hollow before it gave out entirely, narrowing to a pair of ruts so old and so deep they had hardened like ceramic in the dry stretches. My Ranger shuddered in both of them. I parked where the ruts ended and walked the rest of the way on foot, my boots sinking into the wet October leaves up to my ankles. The hillside rose ahead of me like a wall, cedar scrub at the bottom, then a band of older hardwoods, then bare limestone shelves higher up, gray and weathered, jutting from the slope like the broken teeth of something enormous and asleep. The air smelled like wet stone and old smoke from somebody's wood stove a mile downwind. I stood there for a long time with my hands in my coat pockets, looking up at the ridge. A voice behind me said, "You're the one who bought it." I turned around. The man standing about 30 feet away on the gravel track was old, somewhere in his early 70s, tall and lean in the way men get lean when they've spent 40 years walking instead of driving. He wore a brown canvas jacket gone soft at the elbows, and a wide-brimmed felt hat dark with rain. He had a face like weathered oak, lines deep enough you could read them, eyes the color of river water in November. He didn't smile. He didn't frown. He just stood there looking at me the way a man looks at something he's been expecting for a long time.
I'm Thaddeus Crabtree, he said. I farm the next 40 acres over the ridge.
I told him my name. He nodded slowly like the name confirmed something.
Beauchamp, he repeated. You'd be Elias's granddaughter.
I felt the ground shift slightly beneath my boots, though nothing had moved. You knew my grandfather. I knew him 32 years, Thaddeus said. He was the best friend I ever had, and he's the reason I'm standing in this road right now. The rain had eased to a slow, steady drizzle. Thaddeus took a step closer, just one the way you do when you don't want to spook something wild.
Miss Beauchamp,
he said, I need to tell you something about this land, and I'd appreciate it if you'd sit down somewhere dry for the telling, because it's going to take a little while. He had a small cabin half a mile back along the ridge road, set into a clearing he'd cut himself 35 years ago when he first moved up from the lowlands. The cabin was square and solid and built from cedar he'd milled on his own property. Inside, a wood stove ticked quietly in the corner. A kettle sat on top of it, steaming. The walls were lined with books and topographic maps, and a framed certificate from the United States Forest Service commemorating 37 years of service as a federal ranger in the Daniel Boone National Forest. He'd retired in 2018. He poured coffee into 2 enamel mugs without asking if I wanted any. He set one in front of me. He sat down across the small pine table and folded his hands. Your grandfather, Elias, he said, paid the property taxes on that hillside for 30 years, from 1981 to 2011, every November like clockwork. Then, in November of 2011, he stopped. He didn't miss a payment, you understand. He didn't forget. He sat down at his kitchen table and chose to stop. And 1 year later, almost to the day he died, I stared at him over the rim of the coffee mug. That's not a coincidence, is it? I said. No, ma'am, said Thaddeus Crabtree. It is not. He stood up then and crossed to a tall walnut cabinet against the far wall and unlocked it with a small brass key he wore on a leather cord around his neck. From inside the cabinet, he took a wooden box. The box was about the size of a large family Bible. The lid was scored across with old black marker letters that had bled into the grain over the years but were still legible. It read, "For whichever grandchild finds the cave." Thaddeus set the box on the table in front of me. He gave this to me the spring before he died, he said. He made me promise 3 things. First, that I would not open it. Second, that I would not speak of it to anyone. Not your mother, not your Uncle Royce, not anybody. And third, his voice softened, that I would wait. He said someone would come. He said I would know her when she did. I couldn't move. My hands were wrapped around the coffee mug, and I couldn't feel the heat of it anymore. He said her, I asked. He said her, Thaddeus answered. He was very particular about that word. The lid lifted easily. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth tied with cotton twine, were 6 spiral-bound notebooks. The marbled black and white kind you can buy at any pharmacy for $1.50. Beneath the notebooks, a single envelope yellowed along the edges with my last name written across the front in pencil. Not my first name, just Beauchamp, in handwriting I had never seen before, but recognized instantly the way you recognize a voice on the phone before the person says who they are. I lifted the envelope out. My hands were not steady. Inside was a single sheet of lined paper folded twice. The handwriting was small and careful and pressed hard enough into the paper that I could feel the words from the backside like braille. It said, "If you are reading this, you found the hill, and the hill found you. There is no accident in that. I owe you an explanation, and I owe you an apology, and I owe you the truth, but not all at once, because the truth is heavier than you think, and you will need help carrying it. Listen to Thaddeus. He is the only man on this earth who knows what I knew. He kept my secret for me because I was a coward, and he is not. Begin with the notebooks. The notebooks will lead you to the rest." I am sorry I am not there. I would have given anything to be there. Your grandfather, Elias Beauchamp. I read it twice. Then I read it a third time. Then I set the letter down on the table very carefully and pressed both hands flat against the pine boards to stop them from shaking. Thaddeus did not look away. He did not offer me a tissue. He did not say anything soft or sorry. He just sat across from me and waited with the patience of a man who had been waiting for 13 years already and had nowhere else he needed to be. He never came to see me, I finally said. My voice did not sound like my voice. Not once, after my mother and I left the farm. He never wrote. He never called. No, ma'am, he didn't. Why? Thaddeus took a long, slow breath. Because Miss Beauchamp, your grandfather, was a man who believed he had done something so heavy in his life that he had no right to claim love from anyone who hadn't asked for the weight of it. He stayed away from you because he loved you. I know how that sounds. But it's the truth, and it's the only piece of the truth I can give you tonight, because the rest of it belongs to the notebooks and to the hill. I moved the goats to the hillside the following Tuesday. I borrowed Thaddeus's 2-horse trailer. He loaned it without asking what I needed it for, and made 3 trips up the gravel road from Aunt Lurlene's old pasture. The Kiko does 4 of them came first. Then the young Kiko buck I'd borrowed from a woman in Bell County to breed the does before spring. Last of all, Biscuit, my Nigerian dwarf wether, who I'd had since he was 3 days old, and who refused to walk up the loading ramp until I sat down on the trailer floor and let him climb into my lap like a dog. The hillside in the morning light was less menacing than I'd remembered. Frost lay across the lower meadow. The cedars stood dark and still, and beyond them, the limestone shelves of the upper slope shone faintly silver under a sky the color of new pewter. I had run a single strand of polytape electric fence along the lower boundary the day before, 340 feet of it, powered by a battery charger I'd bought, used at a farm auction in Middlesboro for $11. It wasn't a real fence. It was a suggestion,
But the does were Kikos, and Kikos are browsers by nature.
And the moment I unlatched the trailer gate, they spread out across the slope and went to work on the cedar scrub and blackberry cane like animals that had been hired for the job. Within 20 minutes, you could already see the line they were cutting through the brush.
Biscuit stayed near the trailer and watched them with what I can only describe as professional disapproval. I spent the rest of the morning walking the property line on foot, marking the corners with surveyor's tape I'd bought at the Tractor Supply for $2.49. The upper boundary ran along the limestone ridge 60 feet above the cedar line. The rock there came up out of the ground in long gray shelves, almost like steps. In several places, I could see narrow vertical fissures in the stone, some a foot wide, some thinner, running in irregular lines down the face. I made a note in the small green pocket notebook I'd started carrying. I wrote, "Possible hazard. Goats could wedge a leg. Check upper boundary daily." I did not yet know what those fissures were. That afternoon, I drove back to Thaddeus's cabin to return the trailer. The sun had broken through, and the ridge road was steaming slightly in the cold. Thaddeus was on the porch, splitting kindling on a chopping block, his breath visible in the air. He set the maul down when he saw me and walked out to meet me at the truck. "They settle in all right?" he asked. "They're working the lower slope already." "That's a Kiko for you, born to a job." He hesitated, then said, "Miss Beauchamp, I don't want to press, but have you started on the notebooks?" I told him I'd read the first 3 pages and then I'd stopped because my hands were shaking too hard to turn the page. He nodded slowly. "That's an honest answer." He looked off toward the ridge for a moment, the long muscle of his jaw working under the gray stubble. "There's something I need to tell you before you read further," he said. "I should have told you the night I gave you the box, but I'm an old man, and old men sometimes mistake silence for kindness. It isn't always. Tell me what... Your Uncle Royce." The name landed in the cold air between us and sat there. I had not heard the name spoken aloud in 12 years. Royce Beauchamp was my mother's brother, my grandfather's only son. He had left Harlan County when I was 7 years old, the same year my father walked out. Though the two events had nothing to do with each other, and everyone in the family had been very careful to say so. Royce had moved to Knoxville, then to Memphis, then to somewhere in northern Alabama that nobody could ever quite name. He had not come to my mother's funeral. He had not come to Aunt Lurlene's. The last time I had laid eyes on him, I had been wearing a pink jacket and missing 2 front teeth. "What about him?" I said. Thaddeus took a breath and let it out slowly. "Your grandfather and Royce had a falling out in 2009. A bad one. It was about the hill. Royce wanted Elias to sell the parcel, said it was worthless ground and the taxes were a waste of money, and the family needed the cash. Your grandfather refused. Royce told him, and I was standing on this porch when he said it. Miss Beauchamp, so I'm not telling you something I heard secondhand. Royce told your grandfather that one way or another, that land was going to come to him. He said, I'll outlive you, old man, and the law's the law. I felt the cold work its way up under my jacket. And now I've bought it. And now you've bought it, Thaddeus agreed. For $15. At a tax auction your Uncle Royce did not know was happening in a county he hasn't set foot in for 15 years. He paused. But he'll know soon. Property records are public, and a man who waited that long for a piece of dirt doesn't just shrug when somebody else picks it up off the floor. I read the notebooks that night. I read them at the kitchen table in the small rented room I was living in above the feed store in Cumberland, with a single lamp burning and the radiator clanking, and Biscuit's brother Domino, the only goat small enough to fit indoors and stubborn enough to insist on it curled up asleep on a folded blanket by the door. My grandfather had been a careful man. The notebooks were not the journals of a hobbyist. They were the working field notes of someone who had taught himself enough geology to understand what he was looking at and had refused to settle for not knowing. He had borrowed books from the county library in Harlan. I found the call numbers written in the margins. He had cross-referenced his own observations against texts on Appalachian karst formations and Kentucky cave hydrology. He had drawn cross-sections in pencil with measurements taken in feet and fractions of feet, the way a man measures something he intends to come back to. The first entry was dated August 14th, 1971. It read, "The goats found the lower opening on their own." I should have trusted them sooner. I read that sentence, and I stopped, and I looked across the room at Domino sleeping by the door, and I thought he knew. 53 years before I ever stood on that hill, my grandfather had stood there and watched his own goats walk into the limestone fissure and out of sight. And whatever he had found inside it had changed the shape of his life so completely that he would still be writing about it 8 years later in the last entry of the last notebook, dated October 3rd, 1979. The last entry read, "Today I made my decision. I will not move it. I will not speak of it. Not to Ruth, not to the children, not to anyone. The cost of telling is greater than the cost of carrying. May God forgive me for choosing the easier weight." I sat with that sentence for a long time. Then I went back to the first notebook and began to read in order. The cave system, as my grandfather described it, had 3 known chambers accessible through the limestone fissures on the northern slope of the hill. The lower opening, the one his goats had found first, sat at the base of a long limestone shelf, approximately 40 feet below the ridge crest. He'd measured the entrance with a carpenter's tape, 4 feet wide, 3 feet high at the center, passable on hands and knees. Beyond it, the passage opened. The first chamber was roughly oval 25 feet at its widest point, with a ceiling that arched up to perhaps 12 feet at the center. He described it the way you would describe a small chapel. He had spent the better part of the autumn of 1971 mapping it carefully by the light of a kerosene lantern with his 2 young daughters waiting for him on the hillside above, because he would not let them come inside until he understood what was in there. What was in there was a wall. The far wall of the first chamber had been worked, not carved, not decorated, but the surface had been deliberately flattened. A roughly rectangular section about 6 feet wide and 4 feet tall
smoothed down to a face that was noticeably more uniform than the surrounding limestone. Above the smoothed section, 4 shallow horizontal grooves had been cut evenly spaced. Below the lowest groove, pressed into the stone with what appeared to be a narrow, cold chisel, was a year, 1943, and below the year 2 words: Forgive H.T. My grandfather had photographed the wall in October of 1971 with a Kodak Brownie camera. The black and white prints were tucked into the back of the third notebook in a glassine sleeve dated and labeled in his small, careful handwriting. I held them under the lamp and looked at them for a long time. The angle of the flash had caught the cuts cleanly. Forgive H.T. in letters as deliberate and unhurried as a tombstone. He had not known then who H.T. was. He had spent the next 8 years finding out. He had also not known then about the second chamber. He found that one in the summer of 1972, when his older daughter, my mother, was 9 years old and refused to be left on the hillside any longer, while her father disappeared into the rocks. He had taken her in with him, holding her hand, and somewhere near the base of the worked wall, the cave floor had given a faint draft of cold air that none of them had felt before. He noted the date. He noted the temperature differential. He noted that the floor was not floor. The floor was ceiling. There was another room below. He did not go down. Not that summer. Not for years. I read until 2 in the morning. Domino snored softly by the door. The radiator went quiet. Outside somewhere down on Main Street, a single truck passed and was gone. I closed the 6th notebook and sat looking at the cover. I could feel the weight of the rest of the story behind the words I had just read. The 8 years of careful, patient work the man named H. T. The second chamber my grandfather had measured, but never entered the reason he had stopped paying taxes in 2011 and let the land slip toward an auction nobody was supposed to attend, except whichever grandchild was meant to find it. I thought about Royce Beauchamp. I thought about a man who had stood on Thaddeus Crabtree's porch 15 years ago and told his own father, "I'll outlive you, old man." I went to bed. I did not sleep. I went up to the hill at first light. The frost was heavier than it had been the day before. The cedar boughs were stiff and silver, and the goat's breath rose in soft white columns from the lower slope where they were already working. I had brought the green pocket notebook and a 30-foot length of nylon rope and a headlamp I'd dug out of the bottom of a kitchen drawer at 4 in the morning. The batteries were old. I wasn't sure how much light I had. I climbed past the cedar line and up onto the limestone shelves, following the rough line of the upper boundary toward the fissures I had photographed 3 days earlier. The Kiko-does noticed me and lifted their heads, and then after a moment began to follow. I did not call them. I did not need to. They came on their own, the way they had come for my grandfather 53 years ago, picking their way across the rock with that loose, deliberate, almost casual interest goats use. When they have decided that wherever you are going is more interesting than wherever they had been. The fissure I was looking for was the third one from the eastern end of the ridge. My grandfather had photographed it from the same angle I now stood at. In the black and white print taken in October of 1971, the opening was an irregular dark slit in the limestone face, about 18 inches wide at the mouth, framed by two larger slabs that leaned slightly inward. The print had been taken from 12 feet down slope. The fissure was still there. It was exactly where he said it would be. I stopped about 15 feet below it and stood very still. The wind was small. The goats had gathered around me the lead doe, a big Roman-nosed Nubian I had named Vera, pressing her shoulder against my left thigh in the absent-minded way she sometimes did when she sensed I was thinking too hard. I looked at the dark slit in the stone. A draft moved out of it, soft, cool, constant. The kind of breath a hillside makes when there is space behind it. I thought he stood right here. I thought he was 23 years old, and his daughters were waiting on the slope below him, and he was about to walk into something that would shape the rest of his life. I thought $15. I thought of the letter folded in the pocket of my coat. There is no accident in that. I stepped forward. Vera came with me, her hooves clicking softly on the stone. The smaller doe Clover followed behind. The light shifted as I came up under the leaning slabs. The fissure was narrower than the photograph had made it look. I had to turn sideways to fit, and even then, the cold rock pressed against my chest and the back of my coat at the same time. The air inside changed instantly. Cooler still with a mineral dampness that had nothing to do with the October cold outside. It smelled like limestone and old water, and something faintly organic leaves or soil that had worked its way down through some crack I couldn't see. I switched the headlamp on. The beam caught the passage walls. Smooth, water-worn curving gently away from the entrance. The ceiling rose as I went deeper. After about 10 feet, I could stand up straight again. After 15, the passage widened into something larger. I came around a low shoulder of rock, and the chamber opened in front of me. 25 feet wide, 12 feet high at the center, the ceiling arching up like the inside of a turned bowl. The floor smooth and slightly bowed from 100,000 years of patient water. The headlamp beam swung across the far wall and caught the worked section. 6 feet wide, 4 feet tall, smoothed flat by patient hands. 4 shallow horizontal grooves cut across it, evenly spaced. And below them press it into the stone with the same care a man might use to carve his own name on a gravestone. He had time to plan the year 1943. And below the year, forgive H.T. I do not know how long I stood there. Long enough for Vera to wander past me and settle against the calcite shelf at the base of the wall, and begin very methodically to lick the stone the way a goat licks a mineral block. Long enough for Clover to come in behind her and do the same. Long enough for my eyes to adjust to the headlamp's narrow beam and pick out the smaller marks I had not seen at first a tiny notch at the bottom right corner of the worked section, no bigger than a fingernail. A faint scratch above the year,
like a draft mark erased.
The chamber was exactly as my grandfather had drawn it. The wall was exactly as he had photographed it. And I, 19 years old, alone in the dark with a headlamp on borrowed batteries and 3 goats licking salt off a rock, I was the first person since 1979 to see it.
I lifted my hand toward the smoothed stone. I do not know why. There was nothing to touch. There was nothing my hand could add or take away. But I reached out anyway, slowly, the way you reach toward a sleeping animal you do not want to startle. And I laid my palm flat against the year. 1943. The stone was cold under my hand, colder than the air, colder than the dark. Behind me, somewhere outside the cave, far down the hillside and across the gravel road, I heard the sound of a vehicle pulling up at the end of the ruts. A door slammed. I did not move. I listened. A man's voice carried up the slope. Loud. Familiar in a way I did not want to be familiar with. A voice I had not heard since I was 7 years old. "Tamsin," the voice called. "Tamsin Beauchamp, I know you're up there, girl. Come on down. We need to talk about my father's land."
My Uncle Royce had found me already, and I was alone on a hillside I had paid $15 for, with my hand pressed against a wall somebody had carved 81 years ago. And the only thing between me and whatever was coming next was a stranger's promise my grandfather had made me before I was even born. I came out of the fissure slowly. The light outside was harder than I remembered it being 20 minutes earlier. The October sun had broken through the gray, and the limestone shelves were throwing back a flat, white glare that made me squint. I stayed inside the mouth of the opening for a long count of 10, listening, letting my eyes adjust, letting my breathing slow. Down at the end of the ruts, where the gravel gave out and my Ranger was parked there, was a second vehicle now. A black Chevy Tahoe newer model, the kind of truck a man drives when he wants other men to assume he has money. The driver's door was open. A figure stood beside it, hands on his hips, looking up at the hillside. Even at 300 yards, I knew the shape of him. Royce. Beauchamp was a tall man. 6'2", built like my grandfather had been built, long bones, wide shoulders, the kind of frame that aged into stiffness rather than softness. He was wearing a dark canvas coat and a feed cap pulled low, and his hands were shoved deep in his pockets, the way a man stands when he is trying not to look like he's waiting. I clipped the headlamp to my belt loop and started down the slope. Vera came with me. So did Clover. The other 2 does stayed at the calcite shelf inside the chamber, still licking. I did not call the ones with me back. Having a 60-pound Nubian doe walking at my hip is not protection in any real sense, but it is company, and on that hillside in that cold light, with that man waiting at the bottom, I would take any company I could get. He saw me coming when I was still 100 yards out. He did not wave. He did not move toward me. He just stood beside the open door of the Tahoe and watched me come down the rocks the way a man watches an animal walk into a pen he has built for it. When I got within speaking distance, he said, "You've gotten tall." I did not answer. "Last time I saw you," he said, "you couldn't see over the kitchen counter." "What do you want, Royce?" The use of his first name landed where I'd meant it to. His mouth tightened just slightly. He took his hands out of his pockets. "That's no way to talk to family, Tamsin." "I haven't had family since my mother died. And you weren't there for that. So I'd appreciate it if you'd say what you came to say and then leave." He studied me for a long moment. Up close, he looked older than I had expected. There was gray in the stubble along his jaw, and a slackness in the skin under his eyes that had not been there in the one photograph of him. I'd seen a picture from my mother's wedding, taken when he was 26 and she was 23, and the two of them had still been speaking. He must have been pushing 50 now. The years had not been particularly kind. Something in the set of his shoulders said he had spent a long time in places that did not improve a man. "All right," he said. "I'll say it plain. You bought this land for $15. "I did. That land belonged to my father. It belonged to the county. He stopped paying taxes on it 12 years ago." "He stopped paying taxes on it," Royce said, "because by the end, he wasn't right in the head. You wouldn't know. You weren't there. I was." That was a lie. He had not been there. Aunt Lurleen had told me more than once that Royce had not laid eyes on his father in the last 4 years of his life. But I did not say so. I had learned from watching my mother deal with men like him that there is no point arguing with a liar about a thing he has already chosen to believe. "What do you want, Royce?" "I want what's mine, Tamsin. The law of this state on tax auction parcels is murky as hell when the buyer is a direct lineal descendant of the prior owner. There's a redemption period. There's standing. There's 100 ways this comes apart in a courtroom, and I don't want it to come to that. I'm prepared to be generous. I'll give you $10,000 cash today for the deed." $10,000. For a moment, even hearing it from him, even knowing what he was, I felt the number land. $10,000 was 3 years of feed. It was a real fence and a real shed, and a well drilled into the lower meadow where the goats could water themselves in August. It was a margin between me and the edge I had been balancing on for 2 years. I let myself feel the weight of it for exactly 3 seconds. Then I said, "No." His face did not change. He had been ready for that answer. "The first offer is always the one a man like Royce expects you to refuse." "15, then," he said. "No." 20. Royce. He took a half step closer. Vera beside my left thigh lowered her head and gave a single low warning sound. Not a bleat, more like a guttural exhale, the noise a doe makes when something is too close to her kid. Royce stopped where he stood. "You don't know what you're holding," he said. His voice had dropped. The performance of patience was thinning.
You don't know what's up on that hill, Tamsin. You think you do. You think you've been smart. But there's things about this land my father never wrote down for anybody, and you're standing on top of them, and you don't even know what direction to look in. I held his eyes. What's HT? I said. The silence that followed was the longest 3 seconds of my life up to that point. Royce did not blink. He did not move. But something behind his face shifted very slightly, the way a window shifts in its frame before the wind takes it. And in that moment, I knew 2 things at once. The first was that he recognized the initials. The second was that he had been hoping right up until I said them out loud that I did not. Where did you hear that? He said very quietly. It's carved in the rock up there. Show me. No. He took another half step. Vera made the sound again, longer this time. Tamsin, he said, listen to me. You have wandered into something a great deal older and a great deal heavier than you understand. There are people who have been waiting for that hill for a long time. I am the friendliest one. Do you hear me? I am the friendliest one. You and I can split this fare right now, and the rest of it goes away. Or you can hold on to your $15 and find out what waiting 80 years does to a man's patience. Get off my land, Royce. He looked at me for a long beat. Then he smiled, a slow, thin, almost gentle smile, and he stepped back toward the Tahoe. I'll be back, Tamsin, he said. And when I come back, I won't be alone. He shut the door. He started the engine. He turned the Tahoe around in the narrow track with 3 sharp reversals and drove away down the gravel. I stood there until the dust settled. Then my legs gave out, and I sat down hard on the cold stone, and Vera laid her chin across the top of my head, the way she had done when I was 16 years old, and crying into her flank the day after my mother's funeral, and I let myself shake for exactly 2 minutes before I stood back up. Thaddeus was waiting on his porch when I came down off the hill. He had heard the Tahoe. He did not ask. He just opened the cabin door for me and set a fresh mug of coffee on the table without a word. I told him everything, the chamber, the wall, the year, the 2 words pressed into the stone, the way Royce had gone still when I said the letters out loud. Thaddeus listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time, looking down at his hands folded on the table. Finally, he said, Your grandfather found out who HT was in the spring of 1973. He didn't tell me until 1991. He told me because he thought he was dying. He wasn't that round, but he thought he was, and he was afraid of dying alone with it. After he got better, he made me promise never to repeat what he said. I'm going to break that promise tonight, Miss Beauchamp, because the man who made me give it is not here anymore, and you are. He stood. He went to the cabinet again. From a lower drawer, he took out a single folded sheet of paper, brittle and yellowed, sealed inside a plastic sleeve. He laid it on the table in front of me. Read it,
he said. "I'll be on the porch." He went outside and closed the door behind him. The paper was a letter, handwritten. The ink had gone brown with age, and the paper smelled faintly of cedar from the drawer it had lived in. The handwriting was small and rounded and very young. It had been written the date said on the 4th of June, 1944. It read, "Dear Opaline, if this letter reaches you, it means I have not come home from this thing, and I am writing it because there are things I need somebody in this world to know before I cross that water tomorrow, and I am not sure I am brave enough to come back from the place we are going. I have done a wrong thing, Opaline. I have done it last year in the autumn when Mama was sick and the bank was going to take the farm, and I could not make Daddy hear me about how close the edge was. You remember the autumn I am talking about. You remember how I disappeared for 4 days and would not say where I had been. I went to Lexington with 2 boys from the recruiting line. I will not write their names. They are both dead now, and the names cannot help them. We went into the Citizens of Kentucky Bank on the morning of October the 11th, 1943, and we took $47,000 in gold and federal notes. And a man named Wallace Coyle, who was the night guard, tried to stop us, and he was shot. Opaline. He was shot, and he died. I did not fire the gun, but I was there. And there is no law of God or man that lets a boy stand inside a thing like that and walk away clean afterwards. The other 2 were caught on the highway south of Richmond 2 hours after. I was not with them. I had taken my share and gone north into the hills because I knew a place. There is a hillside on what used to be the old Beauchamp tract, where I hunted with our father when we were small, and there is a fissure in the limestone there that opens into a room. I went into that room and I put my share of the gold into a tin box, and I put the box deep into the rock, and I closed the floor over it. Then I went back to the army camp at Fort Knox, and I told nobody. And 3 months later, they sent me to England, and tomorrow they are putting us on the boats. Opaline, if I do not come back, I want you to know 2 things. The first is that I am sorry. The second is that the money is not mine, and it never was, and I do not want it to stay where I put it. There are 4 families in Lexington who carry the harm of what we did. The guard's widow, the teller who was struck and lost the use of her arm, the 2 men whose savings were in that bank and who were ruined by what we took. Their names are written on a piece of paper inside the tin. If I come home, I will set it right. If I do not come home, I am begging you to find a way to set it right for me. I am sorry, Opaline. I have been a coward and a fool, and I have hurt people who never did harm to anyone, and there is no undoing it, only the trying. I love you. Tell Mama I tried to be good. Your brother Hollis. I read the letter twice. The second time I read it, my throat had closed up so tight I could not have spoken if I had needed to. Corporal Hollis Tate, 19 years old, the same age I was sitting at Thaddeus Crabtree's kitchen table. He had walked off a boat onto Omaha Beach on the morning of the 6th of June, 1944. 2 days after he wrote that letter, and according to the casualty list my grandfather had folded into the back of the second notebook, he had been killed before noon of the same day. He had never come home. The letter had reached Opaline Whitcomb in July of 1944. She had been 23 years old, married 6 months, living in Pineville. She had read it once, and she had not shown it to another living soul for 80 years. I went out onto the porch. Thaddeus was sitting on the top step, looking out over the ridge. The light had gone copper. The cedars below the cabin stood very still. I sat down beside him. "How did my grandfather find her?" I asked.
Your grandfather found her the way your grandfather found everything, Thaddeus said. He went to the library. He read newspapers from 1943. The Citizens of Kentucky bank robbery was front-page news for 2 weeks. The names of the 2 boys who were caught were printed in the paper. The third boy, the one who got away, was described as 18 to 20 years old, dark-haired, slim-build, possibly local to the southeastern part of the state.
The report said the bullet that killed the guard had likely come from the second boy's pistol, not the third's. But 2 men still died that day. Wallace Coyle from the gunshot, and one of the captured boys from a beating in a county jail outside Richmond before he ever stood trial. So 3 people died for what those boys did. 3 families. How did he know it was Hollis? He didn't, not for sure, not for a long time, but he started looking at the casualty lists for boys from this part of Kentucky who shipped out to Europe between October of 1943 and June of 1944. There were not as many as you'd think. He cross-referenced them against draft records. He narrowed it to about 30 names. Then he started writing letters to the surviving family of each one. Gentle letters, vague letters, just asking after the boy, trying to feel out which family carried a silence.
And he found one. Opaline.
Thaddeus nodded.
She was living in a small house outside Pineville by then.
Widowed. Her husband had died in 1968. No children. She wrote back to your grandfather's letter, and she said she would like to meet him. He drove out to her place in the fall of 1973, a Sunday afternoon. He sat in her parlor for 4 hours, and when he came home that night, he told your grandmother he had a stomach flu, and he went into the barn alone, and he didn't come out until past midnight. Your grandmother told me about that night 10 years after the fact, after Elias had told me the rest of the story. She still hadn't known what he was actually carrying out there in the dark. I stared at the boards of the porch. He kept the secret for her, I said. He kept the secret for her, yes. Why? Thaddeus was quiet for a long moment. Because he loved her Tamsin. I looked up at him. He loved Opaline Whitcomb, Thaddeus said gently. From the Sunday afternoon he met her in the parlor of her little house until the day he died. Not the way he loved your grandmother. Different. Quieter. He never told her. He never touched her hand. He sat in her parlor twice a year for 40 years, and he listened to her talk about her brother, and he kept her secrets. And he did not once ever ask her for anything in return. Your grandfather was an honorable man, Miss Beauchamp.
He was honorable in a way they don't make many of anymore. And the cost of being that honorable was that he carried a thing in silence for 40 years that no one man should have had to carry alone. I thought about the last entry in the last notebook. The cost of telling is greater than the cost of carrying. May God forgive me for choosing the easier weight. I understood it now. He had chosen not to dig the gold out and turn it in because turning it in meant naming Hollis Tate. Naming Hollis Tate meant destroying Opaline Whitcomb in the last years of her life, destroying the memory of the brother she had spent 60 years trying to forgive, the boy whose photograph in his army uniform still sat on her mantelpiece. My grandfather had decided that the harm of telling was greater than the harm of holding, and he had carried that decision into his grave. And then in 2011, something had changed. He had stopped paying the taxes. He had given Thaddeus the box. He had decided after all those years of holding that the weight needed to pass to someone younger, someone who could choose differently, someone who could finish what he could not. He had bet against every reasonable odd that one of his grandchildren would find the hill. He had bet on me. I need to meet her, I said. Thaddeus nodded. I thought you would. I called her this morning. I looked at him. You called her this morning, Miss Beauchamp? He said with the faintest dry smile. I have been waiting 13 years for you to walk up that road. You'll forgive me for getting a few things in motion ahead of time. She is 103 years old. She does not have a great many mornings left. She would like to see you on Sunday afternoon, if you can come. Opaline Whitcomb lived in a small white-painted house on a quiet street outside Pineville, set back from the road behind a low picket fence and a hedge of boxwood that had been there since before I was born. The porch had 2 rocking chairs on it. A pot of geraniums faded for the season, but not yet dead, sat on the top step. The mailbox at the end of the driveway had her name spelled out in iron letters. A woman in her 50s opened the door when we knocked. She introduced herself as Beverly, the day caregiver, and she led us through a small front hall into a parlor that smelled of cedar and lavender and old paper. The walls were hung with framed photographs, most of them black and white. One of them, in the place of honor above the fireplace, showed a young man in an army uniform smiling at the camera with one hand raised toward his cap. The frame was polished. The photograph was not faded the way the others were. Someone had taken very good care of it for a very long time. Opaline Whitcomb sat in a wingback chair beside the window. She was tiny. Her hands rested folded in her lap on a knitted afghan, and her white hair was pinned up neatly at the back of her head. And her eyes, when she lifted them to mine, were the same color as the photograph above the fireplace. Pale gray, almost silver. She did not stand. "Come closer, child," she said.
Her voice was thin, but very clear. "Let me see you." I crossed the parlor and knelt beside her chair so that our faces were level. She studied me for a long time. She did not speak. She lifted one small hand and laid it very lightly along my cheek. Her skin was cool and dry and weightless. "You have his eyes," she said. I did not know which his she meant. I did not ask. "You bought the hill," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "For $15. "Yes, ma'am." She let out a small breath. It might have been a laugh. It was hard to tell. "Elias used to say to me," she said, "that one day a young person would come to that hill who was not afraid of what was inside it. He said when that day came, I should give them the rest of what I had. I have kept it for a long time, child. I am very tired of keeping it." She gestured slowly toward Beverly, who was waiting in the doorway. Beverly nodded and left the room. She returned a moment later, carrying a small, flat wooden box, dark with age, the kind of box a man might once have carried tobacco in, or a woman might have kept letters in. Beverly set the box on the low table in front of Opaline's chair. "Open it, child," Opaline said. I lifted the lid. Inside were two things. The first was a small folded square of paper brown, with age, the creases worn nearly through. I lifted it out and unfolded it carefully on my knee. It was a hand-drawn list in a young man's careful pencil hand. 4 names. 4 addresses in Lexington, Kentucky, written as they would have been written in 1943 without zip codes. Mrs. Maybelle Coyle, widow, 412 Linden Avenue. Miss Adeline Verge Teller, 88 Walnut Street, Apartment 3. Mr. Houston Pell, depositor, 217 South Ashland. Mr. and Mrs. Sturgis Halloran, depositors, 1144 Magnolia Lane. Below the 4 names in the same careful hand, $47,000 in gold and federal notes. Divide as equal as can be done. H. T. October 1943. I held the paper for a long time. Then I looked at the second thing in the box. It was a small key. Brass. About 2 inches long. The kind of key that fits a padlock from the 1940s. A paper tag was tied to it with cotton string. On the tag in the same young pencil hand were 4 words, 2nd floor. Northwest corner. I looked up at Opaline. "There is a second chamber," I said. "There is a second chamber," she agreed. "He went down into it. Before he hid it, he locked something. He locked a box inside a box, child. He told me so in the letter you read. He said the gold was in a tin, and the tin was inside a heavier strong box, and the strong box had a padlock on it, and he kept the key on a string around his neck the whole time he was in England. The morning before he went onto the boats, he mailed the key to me in an envelope with that note. The key sat in my mother's bureau drawer for 61 years before I found it again after she passed. I have kept it for 19 years more. It is yours now. It was always going to be yours. She closed my fingers around the key very gently with both of her small hands. "Take it down, child," she said. "Take it down and bring it back up into the light and finish what my brother could not." There was the sound very faintly of a vehicle passing slowly on the street outside. None of us turned to look, but I heard Beverly in the doorway draw a small breath. I came home to the cabin above the feed store at dusk. Thaddeus drove me. We did not speak much on the road. The key was in the inside pocket of my coat against my chest, and I could feel the weight of it the whole drive, not the weight of the brass, which was nothing but the weight of what it opened. I climbed the back stairs to my room. Domino was waiting at the door. I let him in and sat down at the small kitchen table with the 4-name list spread out in front of me under the lamp. Maybelle Coyle, Adeline Verge, Houston Pell, the Hallorans. 81 years ago, 4 ordinary lives in Lexington had been broken open by 3 boys with guns who needed money to save a farm. One of the boys had died in a jail cell. One had gone to prison and died there. The third had gone to France and never come home. The 4 broken lives had gone on and had had children, and those children had had children. And somewhere out there in the eastern part of this state, there were grandchildren and great-grandchildren of those 4 families who did not know any of it. I was going to have to find them. I was going to have to walk up to their doors and tell them the story. And before I could do that, I was going to have to go back up onto that hillside with 30 feet of rope and a real flashlight and a man 80 years too late to help me. And I was going to have to go down into the second chamber and bring the tin up into the light. There was a knock at the door. It was past 9 o'clock. Domino's head came up. I crossed the small room and looked through the peephole. A man in a wool overcoat stood on the landing. Middle-aged, clean-shaven, a face I had never seen before. He was holding what looked like a business card between 2 fingers, held up to the peephole so I could see it. The card read, Cyrus Voss. Voss Mineral Holdings, Knoxville, Tennessee. He spoke without my having to open the door. "Miss Beauchamp," he said. His voice was calm and pleasant and perfectly steady. "My name is Cyrus Voss. I have driven a long way to meet you. I represent certain interests with a long memory and a longer patience. I have been speaking with your Uncle Royce. I think we should talk, you and I, about the hill, about what your grandfather knew, and about a man named Hollis Tate." He let the card fall gently onto the doormat. "I'll be back tomorrow," he said. "At noon. I would very much appreciate it if you'd open the door." Then he turned and went down the stairs, and his footsteps were quiet, and a car door closed somewhere out on the street, and he was gone. I stood with my back against the door for a long time. Then I called Thaddeus. He picked up on the second ring. "He's here," I said. There was a pause on the line. Then Thaddeus said very quietly, "Then we don't have until spring, Miss Beauchamp. We go up that hill tomorrow at first light, and we bring the tin out." The wind came up that night across the ridge. I lay awake in the small bed by the window, Domino curled against my hip, the brass key on its string laid carefully on the bedside table, and I listened to the wind work at the loose corner of the roof above the feed store. I thought about Hollis Tate, 19 years old, lying somewhere in the dark of an army camp in southern England on the night of the 4th of June, 1944, writing a letter to his sister and folding a brass key into an envelope and addressing it home. He had been my age. He had been afraid. He had done a wrong thing, and he had spent his last weeks on this earth trying to find a way to undo it. And he had run out of weeks, and the undoing had waited for me. And somewhere out in the dark, in a hotel, somewhere along Route 421, a man named Cyrus Voss was waiting for noon, and a man named Royce Beauchamp was waiting for him. And the only thing standing between two men who had been hunting that hillside for 3 generations, and the tin box that had been waiting 81 years in the dark, was a 19-year-old girl, an old federal ranger with a bad shoulder, a 103-year-old woman in a parlor in Pineville, and the promise a dead man had made to himself in 1979 to choose the easier weight. I closed my hand around the key on the bedside table. It was warm now. It had been against my chest all evening. I held it the way you hold something somebody has trusted you with. And just before I fell asleep with the wind still moving across the ridge, and Domino's small breathing soft against my hip, I thought, tomorrow we go down. We went up at first light. Thaddeus came for me at 5:30 in the morning in his old GMC headlights, cutting through a fog so thick the cedars along the gravel road looked like ghosts of themselves. He had brought a coil of climbing rope from his Forest Service days, a real headlamp with fresh batteries, a folding shovel, and a stainless steel thermos of coffee strong enough to lift a horse. He had also brought, laid across the bench seat between us under a folded canvas tarp, the long Winchester Model 70 he had carried for 37 years, walking the back country of the Daniel Boone National Forest. He did not mention the rifle. I did not ask about it. "You sleep," he said. "Some. That's enough." We did not speak much on the drive up. The fog stayed heavy until we were a quarter mile from the parcel boundary, and then the road climbed, and we came up out of it the way you come up out of water, and the dawn was just touching the top of the ridge, and the limestone shelves were glowing pale gold above the cedar line. He parked the GMC behind a stand of laurel 40 yards short of where the ruts ended. He did not pull up to the end of the road. He did not park where my Ranger had parked the day before. I understood watching him that I was being shown something, a thing a man learns over 37 years walking country, where other men sometimes go armed. You do not park where you are expected to park. You leave yourself a way out. He took the rifle out from under the tarp and slid it into a soft case and slung the case across his back. He put the rope over one shoulder and the shovel through his belt. He handed me the headlamp and the thermos. "Stay behind me until we get to the cedars," he said. "After that, you lead. You know the way in. I don't." We climbed. The Kiko saw us coming and lifted their heads from the lower meadow, and then after a moment began to drift up the slope behind us in that loose, interested way they had. Vera came up alongside me as we passed the cedar line. Clover followed. Biscuit, the Nigerian weather, watched from 100 yards downslope with what I can only describe as moral disapproval and did not come any closer. The fissure looked the same as it had the morning before, the dark slit in the limestone, the two leaning slabs, the faint draft of cool air rising out of it into the cold dawn. Thaddeus stopped 12 feet below it and looked up at the opening for a long time. "I never came up here in all the years I knew him," he said very quietly. "He asked me not to. I want you to understand what I'm about to do, Miss Beauchamp. I am breaking a promise I made to your grandfather. I am breaking it because the man who made me give it would have wanted it broken today by me with you. But I want you to know I am breaking it, and I want you to know it is the only one of his promises I have ever broken." He pulled the rifle case off his shoulder and laid it carefully across a flat rock to the side of the fissure within easy reach. He did not take the rifle out of the case. He just laid it where his hand could find it. Then he looked at me. "You go first," he said. "It's your hill." I clipped the headlamp to my forehead and turned it on. I went sideways into the fissure. The cold and the mineral damp closed around me the way they had the day before, but this time I was not afraid in the same way. I knew what was at the end of the passage. I knew what was on the wall. I knew what was under the floor of the first chamber. The fear I had brought up the hill with me that morning was a different fear. It was a fear with a shape now, and the shape of it was a tin box that had been waiting 81 years. The passage opened into the first chamber. The 4 Kiko did not come in with us. They stayed at the mouth of the fissure, watching the way goats watch a thing they have already inspected and decided is somebody else's problem now. Thaddeus came through the passage behind me and straightened up slowly and turned in a small circle, taking the chamber in. His headlamp beam swung across the worked wall, across the year, across the 2 words pressed into the stone. He stopped when the beam settled on "Forgive HT." He took his hat off. He did not speak. He stood with his hat in his hands for a long count, looking at that wall, and then he set his hat back on his head and walked across to the calcite shelf where the goats had licked the salt, and he knelt down and laid his palm against the cold stone the way I had laid mine the morning before. "All right, Elias," he said quietly. "All right." Then he stood up and looked at me, and the look on his face was the look of a man who has just paid a long debt.
"Show me the seam,"
he said.
I showed him the seam. The crack in the floor ran roughly 8 feet east to west along the base of the worked wall, exactly where my grandfather's notebook had said it would be. In 2 places, it widened to nearly half an inch. The draft of colder air still rose from it slow and steady, the breath of the deeper space below. Thaddeus knelt and ran his fingers along the seam, then took out a small geologist's hammer from his coat pocket. I had not seen him put it there, and tapped the floor on either side of the widest point. The sound on the left was solid. The sound on the right was hollow. "There's your trap door," he said, "or what's left of one. Stone settled over a wood frame, I guess. Frame's long rotted. We're going to have to lift the slab." He looked at the slab. 1,200 pounds, maybe. We can't lift it. We have to break the edge and slide it. Step back, Miss Beauchamp. He worked at the edge of the slab for the better part of 20 minutes with the hammer and a short steel pry bar he had brought in the canvas bag. He worked patiently, the way old men work, never with his full strength, always with leverage and angle. He chipped a small crescent out of the eastern lip of the slab, then a second crescent, then a third. The stone gave way more easily than I had expected. Beneath the broken edge, I could see the dark line of empty space. He set the bar down and wiped his hands on his pants. "Goat going to fit through that," he said. "My grandfather did." "Your grandfather was 23. I am 72. You're 19, and you weigh 120 pounds. You're going first." We rigged the rope around a knob of limestone at the base of the worked wall, a natural anchor my grandfather had also used, judging by the faint old wear marks in the stone, and Thaddeus tied a sit harness for me out of one continuous length of webbing he had carried in his coat pocket. He worked the knots, slowly checking each one twice the way a man checks his work when his work has another person's life inside of it. "You ever rappel?" he said. "No." "It's not rappelling, it's lowering. You go down hand over hand, and I take the weight off the top. You don't fall, you don't fight. You don't panic. If you panic, I lose my grip. If I lose my grip, you fall 30 feet onto rock. Don't panic." "All right." "You hear anything below anything you don't understand. You call up to me, and I bring you straight back. Promise me that." "I promise." He clipped the rope through the harness and braced his good shoulder against the limestone knob and nodded once. I sat down at the edge of the opening with my legs hanging into the dark. The headlamp beam fell straight down into nothing. I could see perhaps 15 feet below a flat stone floor. Wet looking.
the black mineral shine of limestone polished by very old water. Beyond the edge of the headlamp beam, the lower chamber simply went away into shadow. I lowered myself off the edge. The rope took up the slack. The harness bit into my hips. I went down in the dark with my hands on the rope and my boots scraping faintly against the stone wall on the way down, and the air around me got colder and stiller with every foot, and the smell of deep water and undisturbed time rose up to meet me. My boots touched the floor. "I'm down," I called up. "I have you," Thaddeus called back. "Take a minute, look around. Don't move until you know what you're looking at." I stood very still and let the headlamp sweep slowly across the lower chamber. It was larger than the room above, perhaps 40 feet across at the widest. The ceiling was lower 6 feet at the center, less than 5 at the edges. The floor sloped gently downward toward the eastern wall, where I could hear very faintly the sound of water moving. The underground stream. My grandfather had described it in the third notebook. He had measured its flow in the summer of 1972 by floating a wood chip down its length and timing it with a pocket watch. He had calculated that the same water 8 days downstream and several hundred feet lower in elevation came up out of the ground at the eastern base of this same hill as the spring at the foot of the fence line. The spring that had never gone dry. The spring my goats drank from every morning of the autumn I had bought the land. The chamber I was standing in was the throat of the spring. I turned the headlamp toward the northwest corner. The corner was not empty. A small, dry shelf of limestone, perhaps 3 feet above the chamber floor, jutted out of the wall like a natural altar. Sitting on the shelf exactly where the brass key's paper tag had said it would be was a wooden strongbox. The wood was dark with age. Iron bands ran around the corners. The padlock heavy dull, the brass nearly black, hung through the hasp. The strongbox had not been touched in 81 years. I crossed the chamber slowly. My boots made very little sound on the wet stone. When I reached the shelf, I stopped and stood for a moment with the headlamp beam on the box, and I thought about Corporal Hollis Tate, 19 years old, the same age as me, alone in this exact chamber on a night in October of 1943, with a kerosene lantern and a tin of stolen gold and a strong box he had carried in from somewhere and a brass key on a string around his neck. He had stood here. He had set the box on this shelf. He had locked it. He had climbed back up through the trapdoor in the floor above, and he had walked out of this hill and back into a world that was going to send him to France within the year. He had never come back. The key was on its cord around my neck. I lifted it off.
I fit the key into the padlock. It went in smoothly. The mechanism turned with a small, dry click. That was the loudest sound in the chamber. I lifted the padlock out of the house and set it carefully on the shelf beside the box. Then I lifted the lid. Inside, exactly as the letter had said, was a tin about the size of a large bread box, dull gray, the lid sealed with what looked like old wax along the seam.
I lifted the tin out and set it on the floor of the chamber. My hands were not steady. I sat down beside it on the cold stone, and I broke the wax seal with the small folding knife in my coat pocket, and I lifted the tin lid. The headlamp caught what was inside. 23 small bars of gold. They were not large. Each one was perhaps the size of 2 stacked dominoes. They were rough cast. They had the dull, slightly yellowish gleam of gold that has been melted down in a hurry by someone who did not particularly care about the polish of the work. Beneath the bars, wrapped in oilcloth, a small bundle of federal banknotes from 1942 and 1943, brown with age. And beneath those folded twice a second piece of paper. The second piece of paper in the same young pencil hand. If you are reading this, my sister Opaline has trusted you. I am sorry for everything. Please, be better than I was. H.T. I sat on the cold stone floor of the lower chamber, and I held that small piece of paper in my hands. And somewhere 30 feet above me, an old man named Thaddeus Crabtree was holding the other end of my rope, and the morning was coming up gold across the ridge outside, and a goat I had named Vera was waiting at the mouth of the fissure for me to come back out, and I did not cry because there was no time to cry. But I sat there for a long count, and I let the weight of what was in my hands settle into the place inside my chest where it was going to live for the rest of my life. Then I closed the tin. I called up to Thaddeus. "I have it," I said. "Tie it on," he called back. "I'll bring it up first, then you." I rigged the tin to the end of the rope with the webbing he had given me, and Thaddeus pulled it up hand over hand, and the small, dull tin disappeared into the light of the chamber above. Then the rope came back down. I clipped in. I climbed. I came up out of the floor of the first chamber into the cold, pale morning light slanting in through the fissure mouth, and Thaddeus reached down and took my forearm in his hand and pulled me up onto solid stone, and we knelt there together beside the tin for a long count, and neither of us spoke. Then Thaddeus said very quietly, "Your grandfather would be proud of you, Tamsin." It was the first time he had ever called me by my first name. We came down off the hill at 9 in the morning with the tin wrapped in the canvas tarp, and Thaddeus's hand on the rifle case slung across his back. Cyrus Voss was waiting at the end of the ruts. He was not alone. The black Tahoe was parked behind Thaddeus's GMC, blocking it in. Royce Beauchamp was leaning against the hood of the Tahoe with his arms crossed. Cyrus Voss stood beside him in the same wool overcoat he had worn at my door the night before. And there was a third man with them now, younger, heavier built, standing slightly behind the other two, with his hands at his sides, and an expression that said he had been hired for exactly the kind of morning this was about to become. The third man had a pistol in a shoulder holster under his jacket. He was not making any effort to hide it. Thaddeus stopped walking when we were 40 yards out.
"Stay behind me, Tamsin,"
he said. He did not raise his voice. He did not change his pace. He simply walked the next 40 yards down the ruts at the same steady old man's gait he had used all morning with me, half a step behind him, and the tarp-wrapped tin under his left arm, and his right hand resting lightly on the strap of the rifle case across his back. Voss spoke first when we were within easy speaking distance.
"Miss Beauchamp,"
he said pleasantly,
"I see you've had a productive morning." "Get out of the way, Cyrus," Thaddeus said.
Voss looked at him for the first time.
"You'd be the ranger," he said. "I'd be the ranger. I have heard about you. Your interference in this matter has been noted. Step aside, sir. The young lady and I have business to conclude." "The young lady and you have no business at all."
The third man, the one with the holster, shifted his weight slightly. Thaddeus did not look at him. Thaddeus kept his eyes on Voss. Royce spoke from where he was leaning on the Tahoe. His voice was different than it had been the day before. Thinner, tighter. The voice of a man who had been up all night with worse company than he had bargained for. "Tamsin," he said, "just give him the box. Give him the box and walk away. He has resources, girl. He has lawyers. He has people. You don't know what you're doing." "You sold me to him, Royce," I said. It was the first time I had spoken since we had come down off the slope.
"I sold no one,"
Royce said. The words were sharp and a little too quick.
"You sold our family to him for a piece of it. You sold our grandfather. You sold a dead boy from 1943. You sold an old woman in Pineville. You sold all of us, Royce, and you don't even have the decency to look me in the face while you do it."
Royce did not answer. He looked down at the gravel. Voss made a small impatient motion with one hand.
"We're past family pieties, I think. Mr. Crabtree, the box. Now, please."
Thaddeus did not move. In the silence that followed very faintly from somewhere down the gravel road behind the Tahoe, there came the sound of tires on loose stone. Voss heard it. His expression did not change, but his hand, which had been resting easily at his side, went into his coat pocket. 2 sheriff's cruisers came around the bend in the gravel road at a steady pace. No lights, no siren. They pulled up behind the Tahoe, and the doors opened, and 4 deputies and the Harlan County Sheriff himself stepped out onto the road. The sheriff was a man named Boyd Whitley. Thaddeus had known him for 30 years. Thaddeus had called him at 4 in the morning from his cabin before he had come to pick me up. Thaddeus had not mentioned this to me on the drive in. Thaddeus had not wanted me to be thinking about it while I was 30 feet down in the lower chamber. Sheriff Whitley took a slow look at the scene in front of him. He took in Voss, his hand still in the coat pocket. He took in the man with the holster. He took in Royce leaning on the Tahoe looking at his boots. He took in Thaddeus and me and the tarp-wrapped bundle under Thaddeus's arm. He said, "Cyrus Voss, take your hand out of your pocket. Slow." Voss took his hand out of his pocket. It was empty.
"Mr. Voss," the sheriff said pleasantly, "we have been on the phone this morning with the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation. Apparently, the state of Tennessee has had some questions for you for approximately 18 months regarding a missing person from Hamblin County and a great deal of money that did not arrive where it was supposed to. They've been hoping to have a word. You'll be coming with us this morning."
The deputies moved smoothly. The man with the holster was disarmed before he had time to decide whether to be a problem. Royce was cuffed without protest. He did not look at me when they walked him past me to the second cruiser. He looked at the gravel and at the cuffs and at nothing else. Voss looked at me as they walked him to the first cruiser. He did not look angry. He looked thoughtful. 81 years, Miss Beauchamp," he said quietly as he passed. 81 years, 3 generations of my family looked for that hill. You held it for one autumn. "It wasn't yours to find," I said. "No," he said almost to himself. "I suppose not." They put him in the cruiser. Sheriff Whitley closed the door. The cruisers turned around in the narrow track with 3 sharp reversals each and drove back out down the gravel road. And the dust settled, and the morning was quiet again, and Thaddeus Crabtree and I were left standing at the end of the ruts with the canvas-wrapped tin between us and Vera the Kikodo watching us calmly from 20 yards up the slope. Thaddeus turned and looked at me. "That," he said, "is what your grandfather would have called the easier weight." We took the tin to Opaline Whitcomb that afternoon. We set it on the low table in her parlor, on the same spot where she had set the wooden box of letters 2 days earlier. We did not open it in front of her. We did not need to. She looked at the canvas-wrapped shape for a long moment, with her hands folded in her lap on the knitted afghan and the photograph of Hollis Tate, watching from above the fireplace, and the silver in her eyes did not change, but a small, clear track of water ran down the side of her face from the corner of her right eye. "Thank you, child," she said. That was all she said. We sat with her for 2 hours that afternoon. We drank weak black tea from china cups that had belonged to her mother. She told me stories about Hollis as a boy. The summer he had broken his collarbone falling out of a hickory tree behind the barn. The Christmas he had carved her a small wooden duck with a pocket knife and given it to her wrapped in newspaper because they had not had money for proper paper that year. The night before, he left for basic training when he had sat on the back porch with her and held her hand and said, "Opaline, if I don't come back, you finish what I couldn't." "He didn't say what it was," she said softly. "I thought for years he meant his life, the things a boy wants to be, the man he was going to be. It was 41 years before I opened the letter and learned what he had really meant." She looked at me. "You will finish it for him, child, won't you?" "Yes, ma'am," I said. "I will."
She closed her eyes for a moment. "Then I have nothing left to keep," she said. We took the list of 4 names to Lexington the following Monday.
Thaddeus drove. I sat in the passenger seat of the GMC with the small folded paper on my knee and the canvas-wrapped tin in the locked toolbox in the bed. We had spoken on the phone over the weekend to a lawyer in Pineville that Thaddeus trusted an old friend of his who had worked land cases in eastern Kentucky for 40 years. The lawyer had explained the situation. The 1943 robbery was a closed case. The bank itself no longer existed. It had been absorbed 3 times over by larger banks and finally dissolved entirely in 2008. The insurance carrier that had paid out on the original claim had likewise been bought and sold and absorbed until it was effectively no longer a coherent entity that could press any claim today. As a matter of strict law, the question of who owned 23 small bars of cast gold and a packet of 1942 federal notes recovered from private land in Harlan County was genuinely complicated. But the lawyer had said something else. He had said, "Miss Beauchamp, you are not legally required to do anything in particular with what you have found. But what you do with it is going to be the most important decision of your life. I would encourage you to think very carefully about what your grandfather would have wanted." I had already thought very carefully. The 4 names led us to 4 very different doorsteps. Maybelle Coyle, the widow of Wallace Coyle, the night guard, had died in 1971. Her only son, a man named Wallace Coyle Jr., had died in 1998. His daughter, Hollis Tate's victim's granddaughter, was a woman named Lorelei Coyle Pruitt, 58 years old, who taught 3rd grade at an elementary school on the east side of Lexington. She opened her front door at 6 o'clock on a Monday evening and listened to the entire story standing in her doorway with one hand on the frame and the other pressed flat against her chest. When I had finished, she said very quietly, "Come inside, child." We sat at her kitchen table. I gave her the photocopy of Hollis Tate's letter. I gave her the photocopy of the small paper from inside the tin. I told her what my grandfather had spent 8 years trying to do and what he had not been able to bring himself to do alone. I told her about her great-grandmother Maybelle and the widow's pension that had never been enough and the long, quiet harm of what 3 boys had done in October of 1943. Lorelei Coyle Pruitt sat with both hands flat on the table for a long time after I finished. Then she said, "What I want, Miss Beauchamp, is not money. I have a salary. I have a husband with a salary. I have a small life, and I am content in it. What I want is for my grandfather's name to mean something somewhere in this city that is not just the name of a man who died in a bank robbery in 1943. She lifted her eyes to mine. "Set up a scholarship," she said, "at the local college for young people from this county who want to study and cannot afford to. Name it the Wallace Coyle Memorial Scholarship. Do that and put my grandfather back into the world
as a name attached to a kindness instead of a name attached to a wound. That is what I want done with the money.
I nodded. I could not speak for a moment. I will, I said. The Verge family, descendants of Adeline Verge, the teller who had survived the robbery but had lost the use of her left arm and never married, were harder to find. There had been no children. Adeline had lived alone until 1989. We found, after some searching, a great-nephew named Porter Verge, 61 years old, who lived in Cincinnati and ran a small printing business. He flew down to Lexington to meet us. He listened. He read the letter. He asked one question. "My great-aunt," he said, "did she suffer?" "Yes, sir," I said. "She suffered a great deal." He was quiet for a long time.
"I do not want money for what was done to her," he said finally, "but I will accept it in her name, and I will give it to the Lexington Center for Disability Services." She would have liked that, I think. She spent the last 20 years of her life volunteering there. They taught children with arm and hand differences how to write. She loved those children. I want her name on a small plaque on a wall there. That is all. Houston Pell, the depositor, had died in 1956. His descendants were 3 brothers in their 50s living in Louisville. They listened together in the kitchen of the oldest brother's house, with their wives standing behind them. They took the news the way men of their generation take hard news. They did not weep. They did not exclaim. The oldest brother, when I finished, took a long, slow breath and looked at his 2 younger brothers, and then at me. "Our grandfather lost the farm because of that robbery," he said. "He did not lose his life. He did not lose his arm. He did not lose his wife. He lost a farm and the chance to leave that farm to his sons. We are doing all right, Miss Beauchamp. We have all done all right. Take our share and put it into the scholarship the other lady asked for. Add our grandfather's name beneath hers. That is what we want." The Hallorans were the easiest. There was only one descendant left, a woman in her 70s named Mercy Halloran Boudreaux, who lived in a retirement community outside Louisville. She listened without interrupting. When I had finished, she reached across the small table and took both of my hands in hers and held them for a long moment. "Sweet girl," she said, "you have come a very long way to make a wrong thing right. My grandparents lost their savings in 1943, and they spent the rest of their lives talking about it as the wound that defined their generation. They are gone now. Their wound is gone with them. You take that money and you do something good in this world with it, and you tell that old woman in Pineville that her brother is forgiven. Tell her Mercy Halloran said so." I drove home from Louisville that night with Thaddeus asleep in the passenger seat and the tin still locked in the toolbox in the bed. And the road came up dark and quiet beneath the headlights of the GMC. And I thought about my grandfather, and I thought about Hollis Tate, and I thought about how long it can take for a wrong thing to find its way back to being a right one. $47,000 in 1943
had been a fortune.
23 small bars of cast gold and a packet of brittle federal notes in the autumn of 2024 were worth a great deal more than that. The lawyer had estimated the gold alone at slightly under $1.5 million on the open market. The four families had asked between them for 2 scholarships, a small plaque on a wall in Lexington, and a message of forgiveness for an old woman in Pineville. The rest, by their decision and mine, would go to the Wallace Coyle Memorial Scholarship, which would be funded in perpetuity, and which would every year, for as long as the endowment held, send 3 young people from Harlan County who could not otherwise afford it to college. The first plaque on the scholarship's founding stone at my insistence would carry 1 additional name beneath the names of the 4 donors. The name would read, "In memory of Corporal Hollis Tate, 1924 to 1944. Forgiven. Opaline Whitcomb died on the 18th of February. It was a Tuesday, the first true thaw of the spring. The crocuses had just come up along the front walk of her small white house. Beverly, the caregiver, called Thaddeus at 9 in the morning, and Thaddeus called me at 10 past. And I drove over to the house in Pineville with my hands shaking on the wheel of the Ranger, and the wind coming up warm out of the south for the first time in 5 months. She had gone in her sleep, peacefully. Beverly said she had eaten her supper the night before and read for an hour in her chair and gone to bed at 8 o'clock with her brother's photograph turned to face the bed, the way she did every night. The funeral was 3 days later. There were 11 people at the graveside. The minister read from the Book of Psalms. A single bugler from the local VFW post played taps at the end because of Hollis, because she had asked for it, because there was no grave in this country for the brother she had loved. And a bugle call at her own grave was the closest thing to a homecoming she was ever going to get for him. She had left me in her will a small velvet ring box. Inside the box was a plain gold wedding band, worn smooth on the inside. A woman's ring. The note folded with the ring read in her thin, careful hand, "Child, this was your great-grandmother's. She gave it to me to keep because she was afraid your grandmother would lose it. I have kept it for 61 years. It belongs to you now. Wear it or do not. Keep it or do not. But know that the women in your family have been quietly good for a very long time, and that you are part of that line, and that nothing about what you have done this winter would have surprised any of them. Oh, the spring came up green across the ridge. I built the fence first, a real one this time. 4 feet high woven wire oak posts I cut and set myself with Thaddeus's help. It ran the full lower perimeter of the 12 acres and across the upper line just below the cedar shelves. The cost of the materials came out of the small portion of the recovered money the families had insisted I keep for myself against my objection. Mercy Halloran had said very firmly on the phone, the day I told her about the scholarship, "Sweet girl, you put yourself a roof over your head and a fence around your goats. The rest is for the world. But you take care of you." I built a well house. I drilled a real well into the lower meadow 140 feet down, and the water came up cold and clear and tasted faintly of limestone. I built a 4-stall goat barn from cedar Thaddeus, and I milled together on his property. I built a small one-room cabin set back into the laurel at the western edge of the parcel, where the morning light came in through a window over the kitchen sink, and the wood stove sat in the corner, exactly the way Thaddeus's wood stove sat in the corner of his cabin, because I had learned from a good teacher. The herd grew. Vera kidded twins in March. Clover threw a single doeling in April. By June, I had 14 goats on the hillside and a Pyrenees pup named Captain that Thaddeus had picked out for me from a litter at a working farm over in Bell County, and Domino slept on a folded blanket beside the wood stove every night. I closed the entrance to the cave. I did it myself with a heavy steel grate Thaddeus, and I had welded together at his workbench and a length of chain and a padlock. I did not seal it shut. The underground stream still ran beneath that hill, and the spring at the eastern fence line still came up cold and clear every morning, and there was no good reason to choke a thing the land was still using. But I set the grate so that no one could go in, not without my key, not without my permission. I set a small flat stone in the limestone above the grate. The stone was native to the hill. I had cut it myself, smoothed it with a rasp, and pressed the letters into it with a cold chisel, the way Hollis Tate had once pressed letters into the wall of the first chamber. The stone read, Corporal Hollis Tate, 1924 to 1944. Forgiven. I read the last page of my grandfather's last notebook on a Sunday evening in late May on the porch of the small cedar cabin I had built with Captain asleep at my feet, and the goats settled in the lower meadow and the light going gold across the ridge. The last page was a single paragraph written in pencil in the careful pressed hand of a man who had decided what he was going to do and had wanted to put it on paper in case he was not there to say it out loud. It read, Tamsin, if it is you reading this, and I have spent 13 years hoping it would be you, you are 19 years old as I write this sentence, and you do not know me, and I have not earned the right to know you. But I have watched you from a distance for 19 years, child, through every photograph your mother would send your great-aunt, and I have known since you were 3 years old that you were the one who would be brave enough to do what I could not. I did not stay away because I did not love you. I stayed away because I loved you, and I had not yet earned a place beside you. I am sorry I will not see what you become. I am sorry I will not meet the woman you grow into. But I have left you the hill, and I have left you Thaddeus, and Thaddeus is the brother I never had in this life, and the two of you will be all right together. Take care of him for me, child. He has been carrying my secret for 30 years, and he is tired. And he will not say so, but he is. Love him for me. I am proud of you, Tamsin Beauchamp. I am proud of you in a way no dead man has any right to be proud of anybody. Go finish what I could not. Your grandfather, Elias. I closed the notebook. The light on the ridge had gone copper. Down in the lower meadow, Vera lifted her head and looked toward the cabin and then went back to grazing. Up on the porch of the cabin, half a mile across the ridge, I could just see through the laurel the small glow of Thaddeus Crabtree's reading lamp. He had told me the week before that the doctor had said his shoulder would not heal entirely. I had told him that was all right, because there was a 4-stall barn now, and a real fence and a well, and there was not going to be very much for either of us to lift again that we could not lift together. I sat on the porch a long time. I thought about Hollis Tate, 19 years old, climbing down into a chamber under a hillside in October of 1943, with a tin of stolen gold and a brass key on a cord around his neck, choosing to leave the easier weight behind him for someone else to carry someday. I thought about my grandfather, 23 years old, standing in front of a wall in 1971, reading the letters, "Forgive H.T., and beginning the 8 years of patient work that would teach him who that boy had been. I thought about Opaline Whitcomb, 23 years old, in 1944, opening a letter from England and folding it up and putting it in a drawer and carrying it 61 years before she could bear to read it a second time. I thought about a $15 paddle raised in an empty auction room in October of 2024. I thought about how long it takes a thing to come around, how patient the dead are, how they wait. The sun went down behind the ridge. I went inside. I lit the lamp on the small kitchen table. I sat down with a clean sheet of paper and a pencil my grandfather had once owned, and I began to write a letter to a third-grade teacher named Lorelei Coyle Pruitt to tell her that the first 3 Wallace Coyle Memorial Scholarship recipients had been selected, and that one of them was a girl from Cumberland whose mother had died of cancer and whose father had walked out when she was 7, and who wanted to study agricultural science at the University of Kentucky in the fall. The girl's name was not important. She was 19 years old, and she had grown up with goats, and she was the first person in her family in 4 generations to go to college. I signed the letter with gratitude, T. Beauchamp. Outside, the wind came up warm across the ridge. The hill was quiet. The wait at last had passed.